bones. That was one of the reasons why for a while there was this fad going around about shark cartilage, and that was supposed to inhibit cancer and things like that, because cancer requires blood vessels, and cartilage inhibits blood vessels from forming. There's nothing special about the cartilage of sharks, they just happen to have a lot of it. Unfortunately, people are killing a lot of sharks just to get cartilage. But anyway, so some of the differences and similarities we see with these and the bony fish. So again, we do have a streamlined body for moving through an aquatic environment. But the analogies are rather interesting because embryologically they're very different. For example, we do have the paired and unpaired fins, but they develop from different structures embryologically. And the support structures are different. And they don't have a fin fold. They developed the unpaired fins separately. And so it's really kind of interesting that we end up with so many similarities, yet different developmentally. And so we're talking about analogies in that way. But so here we have our two dorsals and our caudal fin, our unpaired fins. Now this particular family of sharks are called the Squalidae. They don't have an anal fin, but other sharks would have an anal fin here right behind the anus. Okay. Another difference between sharks and the bony fish, again the bony fish, the caudal fin comes off the posterior end of the caudal peduncle of the rest of the body. Right? So the body ends and the tail begins. Whereas in the sharks, the caudal fin is actually surrounding the tail. So here's the body. You can see the body coming all the way up here into the upper lobe of the tail fin. So the tail fin is actually coming off the both dorsal and ventral sides of the body itself. And so you end up with this asymmetrical tail, where the upper lobe is typically longer than the bottom lobe. And that gives them a lot of thrust, but as a result, it tends to pitch them nose down. That's why they need these rigid wings. So they don't have those ray fins. They have these rigid fins, but they're like wings. That gives them lift in the front. And so propulsion forward tends to nose down, the lift in the front, nose up, and they equalize out. The shark glides very effortlessly, like a glider through the water. And to watch a shark swim, the whole body is just this undulating, very smooth gliding through the water. It's a very beautiful motion to watch these things. Other systems to know, this particular shark is called the spiny dogfish. Fishermen call sharks dogfish quite often. Spiny because at the leading edge of each fin is a spine. So there's a little spine here, a little spine here, although it looks like they cut them off when they sent them to us, because we do one poke on the fins. And there's a mild venom within the mucus associated with those spines. So again, purely defensive. Something comes behind and tries to bite it, likely to get a bite of that spine. Okay? Now, they don't have scales. What they do have is teeth. They actually have teeth in their skin. They're called dermal denticles, skin teeth. And they actually have the whole enamel, pulp, denting structure of a tooth in every one of these little bumps. And they're, again, pointed backwards for streamlining. So if you stroke a shark from nose towards the tail, it feels very smooth. You go the other way, and it feels rough, because now you're going against the teeth. And in some sharks, it's very rough. And in fact, in some cultures, they actually use it as sandpaper, as abrasive for polishing. Or samurais would wrap the hilts of their swords with them to get a better grip. When I was working on reproductive physiology in leopard sharks, I was taking a blood sample from the shark and holding her body down, and she was like whacking me with her tail, but I was concerning with controlling the front end of the shark and taking a blood sample until I noticed that blood coming down my arm. That just from her whacking my arm with her tail, she was like abrading my skin away, and it was bleeding. Obviously, I was sticking a needle in her. I couldn't blame her. But again, little actual teeth in their skin. And that actually continues in their jaw. That in their jaw, instead of having one row of teeth embedded in their jaw like a bony fish does, or like you do, they actually have multiple rows, get probe in here, of teeth in their jaws. And so just like and it's just in the skin, in the dermis of their skin. So they're constantly making new teeth, which are then migrating forward, so they always have sharp teeth, and then they shed those teeth. So they're shedding teeth and replacing them with new teeth from behind. So they always have sharp teeth. They never wear them out or get them worn down or anything like that. And that's one of the reasons why the fossil record of sharks is so good, because there's layers and layers of shark teeth. That sharks have been shedding teeth for as long as there have been sharks. And there's lots of again, variation in structure. So these guys are mostly feeding on things like small fish and squid, so they have little sharp pokey teeth for grabbing onto squirming prey and swallowing them whole. If you had something like a ray that's eating shellfish, it would have big flat plates for crushing shells. If you had something like a tiger shark or a white shark that takes bites out of things, more triangular tooth with serrated edges for cutting tough meat. So again, you can often tell a lot about what an animal eats by looking at its teeth. Another difference is in most of the bony fish, the mouth is at the anterior end of the body. Whereas with the sharks and rays, it's underslung. It's down here on the ventral side of the head, which gives it a little more leverage. And for a long time, people thought that meant that sharks had to like turn upside down in order to bite anything. But it turns out that they actually have the ability to lift their nose up and project their mouth out. So it's a project mouth, so they can actually just kind of lift their snout out of the way, jaw shoots forward, and grabs whatever it is they're feeding on. It's pretty interesting. I've fed sharks, and watching them do that is pretty interesting. And again, the sensory systems are amazing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Speaking of sensory systems, so again, pretty big eyes. This family of sharks is again that sort of mid-water, dim light part of the ocean. So very well-developed eyes with a reflective layer in the back, which we'll talk about in lecture tomorrow, if we get that far. Like a cat's eyes, where you shine a light at it and it glows back at you. So dim light, so they get two chances to see the light. It shines through their retina once, bounces off the back of their eye, back again. So it gives them two chances to see the light, makes their eyes very sensitive that way. And again, the nostrils, whereas on the bony fish tend to be on the top of the head, and the sharks and rays tends to be on the bottom of the snout here. But again, two openings on either side. So again, water flows across that. It's purely sensory. They don't breathe through it. Okay. Let's see, what else should we look at? In terms of sensory systems, they do have a lateral line system, like we saw in the bony fish. So a series of pores with those vibration sensors in them, so they can feel anything coming at them. They can feel themselves around. And this particular fish does school, so they swim in schools, knows where the other members of the school are. But interesting, in the sharks, in addition to running down the side of their body, it also runs across their face. So there's branches of it around their eyes, branches of it around their mouth. So they can feel if something's coming at their eyes. In particular, they're trying to eat something, they can protect their eyes because they can feel if something's coming at their eyes. Or again, it's hard to see what you're biting down here, but they can feel where it is by their lateral line extension. So by those vibrations in the water, pressure waves in the water, they don't have to see it. They can know exactly where it is and can bite it. Okay, so the lateral line extending onto the head here. In terms of olfactory systems, very sensitive olfactory systems, much more so, in general, much more so than the bony fish. These things can smell fish blood from miles away. They can track it, trace that track like a little bloodhound, tracing it for long distances. They can, in some cases, it's believed they can actually smell their way home to a home lagoon or something like that when it's breeding season, although salmon can do that as well. So a large portion of their brain is actually devoted to an olfactory system in proportion to the bony fish, which would have more of their brain, more to their visual system. In addition to those senses, another sense which we'll talk about in lecture a little bit are these little black pits all over their snout. See those little black dots? They're actually little tiny pores all over their snout here. And that's not acne. It's a structure called the ampullae of Lorenzini, and they're electrical sensors. They can actually detect electrical fields. And so they're so sensitive that they could be swimming over the surface of the sand and detect if there's a fish buried in the sand underneath it, just by the breathing action of that fish breathing under the nerve action stimulating the muscles to ventilate their gills creates enough of activity. These things can detect that. And for example, a hammerhead that eats rays or flatfish buried in the sand, the big head looks like a minesweeper, and that's what they're doing. They're looking for electrical fields under the sand. And they can then dig them out, they can tell they're there and then dig them out. Or if, again, they can feel something when they're biting something, not only have they got the ampullae of Lorenzini, the lateral line system, but the ampullae of Lorenzini. They can feel the electrical field of anything trying to swim away. Also, they can detect, your skin is a really good insulator. You get a cut in your skin, you're leaking ions. They can pick out a wounded fish because that's the one leaking ions. by detecting the electric field. And of course, you get ions in motion, you get salt water moving in a current, that creates a magnetic field they can use it to navigate with as well, by detecting currents, not only by the pressure waves they generate, but by the electric field generated by saltwater ions in motion. So it's a really interesting, again, way they perceive their world that we really can't relate to. Now, unlike the bony fish that have an operculum over their gills, they have separate gill openings for each gill. In most sharks, there's 5. These, we call them gill slits. So instead of one operculum over their gills, there's individual gill slits, usually 5, although in some cases there's 6 or 7. And so, again, water goes in the mouth, over the gills, and out these gill slits. And so when the shark is breathing, you see those gill slits kind of flaring as they're pumping water over their gills. Again, some of the open ocean sharks, ramjet ventilation, just swim continually. Some of the bottom sharks pump water over their gills by buccal pumping, just like we talked about. So some people, again, have this idea that sharks have to swim their whole life. That's the shark. Some of the bottom dwellers, the ones that sit on the bottom, particularly the rays, but even some of the sharks, have a 6th gill slit that's on the top of their head. It's called the spiracle. And that allows them to breathe without opening their mouth. So they can swim, keep their mouth closed, keep themselves nice and streamlined in the water, or a ray sitting on the bottom where its mouth is in the sand, and they can pump water in that one over their gills and out these slits. So there's no gills associated with that slit. It goes to the gill chamber. So they can pump water in through the spiracles, over the gills, and out the gill slits, and ventilate their gills that way. Okay, let's see what else we can talk about. All sharks and rays have internal fertilization. Most fish have external fertilization. Most sharks and all rays have live birth. The skates and some sharks do lay eggs. But if you're going to have, in either case, you have internal fertilization. If you have internal fertilization, you need a copulatory organ. And so, unlike the bony fish, you can tell males and females by looking for the copulatory organs. And those are actually located here on the pelvic fins. Another difference actually before that, the pectoral fins in the bony fish, usually the pectoral fins were here, the pelvic fins here. In the sharks, pectoral fins here, pelvic fins back here. So it's kind of like in the bony fish, you're standing upright, right, with your tail back here, whereas the sharks, you're more like lying down, your tail's going between your legs. Right, so your pelvis is moved back that way. So these are the pelvic fins. And in the males, the inner edge of each pelvic fin is coiled into this copulatory organ. That's called a clasper. Okay? And so there's one on each side. And so these are used, originally when people saw these, they weren't sure what they were for. They thought maybe they were holding the female with it, hence the name clasper. But we now realize it's actually the copulatory organ. And so when these things are copulating, here's we call it the anus, but it's actually the cloaca, the vent to the cloaca. Remember, a cloaca is a common opening to the digestive, excretory, and reproductive systems. So that's where sperm would come out. And so they fold this across, and there's a little siphon gland here, so that sperm is ejaculated down this hollow tube, and then this siphon gland here pumps fluids to ejaculate the fluid inside the female reproductive tract. Okay, and you can see they even have little spines on them to lock them in place during copulation. But sometimes the females get even by swimming off of the ends of them, so a little give and take there. A little shark sex is not pretty. Again, part of the interesting thing is, how do you copulate in midwater? Right? There's a whole lot of leverage and balance and things going on with that, and sharks have to deal with that. And they can't swim while they're copulating, and so sometimes when sharks are copulating, they'll crash into the bottom. It's very exciting about it. But some of the things like the cat sharks, which are much more elongated, flexible bodies, the male will kind of wrap himself around the female and they'll cuddle at the bottom. The open water ones, they're not so flexible. Okay, so you can tell a shark, male or female. Obviously a male, it's got claspers. So the female would have the pelvic fin, but no clasper. Okay, anything else on the outside before we go in on this? So again, the asymmetrical tail. And again, most sharks would have an anal fin. This particular family does not. Okay, so if we see if we can get in, how good these things are. Get really tough skin on these things. When you do dissections, you only use a scalpel to get through the skin. After that, scissors are the better way to go. You're less likely to massacre everything. Of course, having a sharp scalpel is better than a dull one. Got here. Okay, so we get up here between the gills, that's where you're going to find the heart. Right, so remember we have a single circuit circulatory system, so blood flows from the heart to the gills, so put your heart there next to your gills. So here's the heart. Okay, right between gills. See, so conical structure, typical what we'd expect to see in a heart.
Where's the heart again?
It's right here. It's gray because it's preserved. Yeah, this is a preserved specimen. So, fairly muscular structure here, again for pumping blood to the gills and from the gills to the rest of the body. Then we come to liver. Liver on sharks is huge. 25% of its weight can be its liver. Liver is huge for a whole bunch of reasons. Remember, as we talked about, the liver is kind of your biochemical factory, so it's doing a lot of jobs. It's also used as a storage organ for energy, so it stores a lot of oil in it for long term, so they can go a long time between meals. They store living off that oil in their liver. There's 3 lobes to it here. It's also their buoyancy organ. That in the bony fish, what was the buoyancy organ? The swim bladder, right, which they can inflate and deflate with gas. So the advantage of a swim bladder is you can change buoyancy by changing how much gas is in there. The problem with it is what happens when you change depth and you have a gas-filled bladder. Pressure-volume ratios, right? Just like we did in our gas exchange lab exercise. So if a bony fish changes depth, its swim bladder changes size faster than they can fill it or load it with oxygen. And so if it comes up, all of a sudden it's going to overexpand, it's going to become buoyant. If it goes down, it's going to constrict, it's going to be heavy. And so it's changing its ability to be buoyant depending on the depth. So if you're a fish that changes depth a lot, or changes depth rapidly, the swim bladder is a problem, because if you try to come up too fast, it's going to overexpand, and it's like you holding your breath and coming to the surface. Your lungs overexpand. And so if you've ever gone or seen anybody who's gone like rockfish fishing and pulls up a rockfish from 100 feet down, all of a sudden its guts are bulging out its mouth by the time you get it to the surface, because it's overexpanded and blown out its internal organs. Whereas if you use oil as your buoyancy organ, that's not going to change volume as you change depth. So a shark often hunts by either shooting straight at the surface or diving down and doing these big depth changes while it hunts. And so it doesn't have to worry about its buoyancy organ expanding or contracting. So it's much more amenable to an animal that hunts that way. Tuna is the same way. Tuna is a bony fish, doesn't have a swim bladder because it does a lot of depth changes when it hunts. Okay, but it doesn't have this huge liver. And they will gradually change the oil composition in their. So, for example, if you catch a midwater shark and put it in an aquarium, it's often kind of like trapped at the surface because it's too buoyant. gradually it'll change the oil composition in its liver and be more neutral and be able to swim around. Or they've done this, you actually hang weights on a shark, it'll kind of be dragging along the bottom until gradually it'll change the oil composition of its liver and become a little more buoyant and able to swim around easier. So it's slower to adjust than a swim bladder, but you don't have to worry about changing depth rapidly. Sharks, one of the things about sharks, which we'll talk a little bit about, is that they're very slow reproducing. They tend to be rather old by the time they can start breeding, and when they, again, because they have internal birth, live birth, they don't make a whole lot of babies compared to bony fish, which you saw those ovaries were just packed with eggs. So they tend to be slow reproducing, so every shark fishery in the world is crashed because they don't reproduce fast enough to replace themselves. And so that's been a recurring problem. And one of the first places we saw that was during World War II. In World War II, people were to avoid vitamin A deficiencies would take cod liver oil. Cod liver oil's got a lot of vitamin A in it. But during World War II, in submarine warfare in the Atlantic, the cod fishery shut down. There was no cod liver oil. So somebody said, you know, there's vitamin A in shark livers. Let's, in the Pacific, start hunting sharks. And they hunted sharks, and there's some species of sharks on the west coast here that used to be abundant before World War II. They have yet to recover from that fishery. You almost never see a soup-fin shark, for example, on this coast anymore. It used to be so common, it was a common fishery, fish shark. Same thing with basking sharks. Basking sharks, the second largest fish in the world. Things get to be, 30, 40 feet long. You could get 100 gallons of oil out of one shark. Again, used to be fairly abundant. They actually were a hazard in navigation. They were so abundant because they were so big and would hang out at the surface. Now you almost never see them. So they were hunted for their livers. Fortunately, before all sharks were wiped out, they came out with synthetic vitamin A. We no longer need to use fish oil. But there are still some compounds in shark liver that have been found to be very special lubricants, some potential medical applications, so there is still some interest in them. But that's most of the unfortunate target for sharks now is this ridiculous idea that shark fins make great soup. Right? And it's just a thickening agent. It has no flavor. It doesn't really contribute anything. But it's like this macho thing that I ate a shark. But the problem is that you can get hundreds of dollars a pound for shark fins, or only cents for pounds for shark meat. So people will catch sharks, cut the fins off, throw the shark overboard, and just keep the fins. So they're catching tons of sharks to get a few pounds of fins. Hammering sharks. Okay. So don't eat shark fin soup. Okay, so liver, huge organ. Again, the liver secretes into, again, makes bile salts, like we talked about in the mammalian digestive system, secretes those with the gallbladder. Here's the gallbladder on the underside. Kind of bright green there. Okay. Okay, so we get the liver out of the way. We then come again from the pharynx into this, into the muscular stomach. Stomach again folds back like we saw in the bony fish too, so it kind of folds backwards and then down to the intestine. Here we go. Here's the spleen. Again, used for conditioning and blood cells, and as probably an immune function in sharks. So muscular stomach. Then we come into the spleen, and then we come down to this interesting structure. So instead of having a really long gut with all these long tubes, they have a different way of increasing residence time without adding length. And that is this structure here called the spiral valve. The spiral valve is their intestines. But instead of just being a straight tube, the inside of it has these ridges that makes a spiral staircase pattern. So that by the time the food travels from here to here, it actually is going around and around and around and around. So it gives a long residence time without filling up their gut with a whole lot of intestines. So let's see if we can open this up, see that structure. So again, when you're not cutting through skin, the best way to use your scissors is stick the point in and spread, as opposed to trying to cut with it. Okay. So that way things tend to tear more along natural lines. And then you need to extend that a little longer. So you can see the inside. Oops. Get it to spread a little bit here. That these ridges, I have to expand it a little bit more. There we go. These ridges inside here that make the path of food through the intestine travel this long pathway down the intestine. Okay, so again, instead of having this long gut, spiral valve, unique structure only found in sharks, of being able to do that. And then back here by the anus, I'm gonna cut back far enough. This little sausage-like structure here, that's the rectal gland. Remember we talked about the rectal gland and osmoregulation? So that's used for salt balance. Remember that even though they're hypertonic to seawater, they're low in salt, so they need to constantly be pumping out salt. So that's, besides their gills, it's one of the tissues that they have that's constantly dumping salt out of their body. Okay, so again, that's what I was harvesting for people who are studying chloride channels, little rectal glands. Like we had in the bony, so there's no swim bladder. So it's pretty empty in here, right? Because we don't have these loops of gut because we have a spiral valve. There's no swim bladder. So it's kind of this big hollow thing here. But here's the kidney running along the back of the body cavity. Right? The kidney runs the back of your body cavity, right? That's why the kidney in some cultures is, signifies your deepest emotions, your deepest part of your identity, because it's the deepest part of your body. Just as an analogy. So that's the kidney around there.
The pink part?
And then this was a, what gender? Male, so we expect to see what type of gonad?
Testes.
Testes. So here's the testes. Okay, so testes are up here, which would then be connected to the seminiferous tubules, which would then go back to the cloaca as well. Okay, again, a female would be just full of these big eggs, and pretty big in sharks. Another difference in females, which again we don't have one here to show you, is that again we said that most of them have live birth, which means they have a uterus. And so from the ovary, the egg's sperm, when they copulate, is stored in the shell gland. So the eggs are released, go through the shell gland, are fertilized. You then lay down a membrane around them, and then they would develop in the ovary. Most bony fish broadcast their eggs. The few that do have live birth develop actually inside a hollow ovary. So they don't have, most bony fish don't have a uterus. They have a hollow ovary, which any live birth would develop actually in that, where sharks actually do have a uterus. And as we'll talk about in a reproduction lecture, some of them actually form a placenta. Okay, let's see. So we did liver, gallbladder, spleen, stomach. Again, all sharks are carnivores, so we don't really see much in the way of fermentation structures that you'd have in an herbivore. So not a whole lot in the internal organs. Okay, questions? No? Okay.
Not like really tough. Pointing it all. Elephants.
Oh, I was going to talk about the sensory systems and how sensitive that was, where they could feel things around their mouth. I was feeding blue sharks off of San Diego, and I had an armored glove on, but I would hold the fish in my hand, and the shark would like munch its way down the fish and know exactly when it got to the end of the fish, and I'd be left with nothing but the caudal fin of the mackerel. And again, they knew exactly where the fish ended, my hand began, and would munch that far and stop. So their ability, even though, because the idea was that they can't see what they're eating, but they can sense exactly where things are with those other senses. Okay.
Aren't dogfish like an invasive species?
Dogfish, invasive species? No, they're naturally occurring in temperate waters around the world.
Okay.
It's possible that their numbers may increase as other species of sharks are being eliminated, but I haven't seen anything to that effect. Most of these are caught in the Atlantic. These are actually, if you get fish and chips in England, this is probably what you're getting is dogfish. They're called greyfish there on the market. They don't tell people don't want to buy sharks. Oh, we're going to have greyfish. It's shark. You don't have to worry about bones, right? Some of them are very tasty. You get mako, thresher, like that. Others, not so much. But again, they all have that high urea content in them, so you have to soak them to get all that out if you are going to eat them.
Why their gills are so small?
Are the gill slits small?
Yeah.
I guess to focus the water flow more tightly. But you're right. If you look at a white shark, they're much bigger. A basking shark, they're huge.
Compared to the bonnet fishes are like the whole head is gills almost.
Yeah.
But this guy is
They cut it.
Let's go look. I don't know. Looks. Remember, it's different color because it's preserved. This red, you expect it to be red because it's vascular tissue, gas exchange tissue, vascular tissue. But you see, there's a couple of arches in each slit here.
That looks like
Get
a
it.
mushroom.
Yeah, the underside.
Good thing they won't be on this exam, right? Mushrooms were on the last exam. Yeah, I don't know that I've heard anything looking at the surface area of gills in sharks versus bony fish. I certainly know that more active fish have bigger gills than less active fish. So it may be that just this family is not considered that much of an active fish. And it is actually another interesting point, since you brought that up, is that sharks actually have the largest brain per body